I have avoided trying to get stuff done in Washington regarding GMOs over the last 13 years, and focused, well, specifically more in the last 7 years, focused more on consumer action based on education, because that is something where Monsanto is weak, and as far as government manipulation, they are extremely strong. So I didn't want to go up against the strength of Monsanto. You know, there was a quote in the FDA, by an FDA person about Monsanto in the New York Times that said the regulatory agencies have done everything that Big Ag has asked them to do and told them to do. And that's the case. They have been basically in charge of policy. And so, as a small organization with little resources, how do I, Monsanto spent $2 million in the first quarter of 2009 lobbying Washington. That's chump change for them. It's, far more than we've ever raised. So, the whole, in order to deal with the politics, I think we can go around the politics and go to where the real power lies at the top of the food chain with consumers. And we demonstrated with RBGH, where 55 of the top 100 dairies have committed to remove it from part or all of their product line.
I'm sorry, how many?
55 out of 100. The latest, Dannon and Yoplait committed to remove it by the end of this year, or August 1st. Yoplait by August 1st, Dannon by the end of the year. Walmart's taking it out, Kroger's, Starbucks, etc. And that was because we linked the drug milk, we meaning collective organizations, linked the drug milk to cancer and to other problems regarding health. Now, what we saw in the United States with RBGH was a slow motion tipping point because it started around then in 2005 and is still happening. In Europe, it was a fast tipping point because it was high profile.
And we missed it in the United States. I read a letter that was written by Kellogg's CEO to Ronnie Cunnings of the Consumers Union Group, saying we don't put the genetically modified products into Europe because there's so much consumer resistance, but here in the United States there's little resistance, so we use the GMO. Why did we miss it in the United States?
Okay, it was primarily because of the lack of reporting by the mainstream media. When the arpad pesticide story hit in Europe, 750 articles were written in a month about GMOs. Nothing was reported in the major media. Project Censored, a media watchdog group, described the arpad pesticide story as one of the 10 most underreported events of the year. And I was watching GMOs carefully at the time. We were very excited one day when Time magazine talked about GMOs in the international edition. We were waiting for it to appear in the United States. The U.S. edition didn't say a thing about it.
Why?
There's a number of reasons. I describe in my book, Seeds of Deception, a chapter called Muscling the Media. And it talks about how Monsanto actually tracked reporters who were writing on RBGH as either favorable to them or unfavorable to them, rewarded those that were favorable to them, and threatened those that weren't. They actually approached editors and got reporters reassigned. They bragged in their notes that were leaked later that they had gotten Marion Burroughs taken off the case at the New York Times. Later on, their threats to Fox TV about a 4-part news series that was going to link RBGH to cancer was ultimately canceled because of the threat for dire consequences. Advertising dollars were probably a big issue there. Rupert Murdoch also owned an advertising agency that Monsanto was a client, so they could have withdrawn that money. There's a corporate control. So it's a conscious effort to threaten and stop negative reporting on GMOs. And there's a huge multi-million-dollar effort that's been very successful in indoctrinating reporters about the positive myths of GMOs. One reporter from a very major organization said that she believes that Monsanto's PR people are trained in intimidation tactics because she was reporting honest truth about things that were going on related to Monsanto's GM crops and was, hassled, practically threatened.
But I've talked to people who live in St. Louis, and I've said, you live at where the home headquarters is for Monsanto. Do you hear much about the company? What do you think of it? And they all have very positive reports, and they tell me that if you work there, you truly think you are doing a great thing in terms of feeding the planet. And I ask them, what about the health concerns? What about, even to the far end of the spectrum, GMO means God move over, that we are doing something very Frankenstein with food. And apparently there's not much discussion of that in their own hometown.
Yeah, I've talked to former and current Monsanto people, and I've gotten some very interesting feedback. One former Monsanto employee, the reason he accepted his position at Monsanto was because he read the words of Robert Shapiro about how GMOs would help the world. And when he was at the new employee orientation meeting in the headquarters in St. Louis, he mentioned to all the people there how excited he was and listed all the things that Robert Shapiro said. And then a vice president pulled him over afterwards and said, wait a minute. What Robert Shapiro says is one thing, what we do is something else. We're here to make money. We don't even know what he's talking about. He's just the front man that tells a story. So he was shocked, realizing it was all myth, and the vice president knew it was a myth, and he would have been roped in, and that's why he took the job. Then he found that there were some new proteins being created in genetically modified cotton, and the cotton products were being fed to dairy cows, and he had been reading about mad cow disease, so he knew that it's possible, theoretically, for a cow to take a prion and for it to end up causing death and disease in humans. And he tried to stop the feeding of this cotton product to the cows because they had never tested these new proteins that had been introduced completely accidentally due to the massive collateral damage that occurs during the process of genetically engineering the cotton. And no one paid attention to him. They started ostracizing him. His team kind of moved away from him. He said he tried to blow the whistle. He spoke to professors at University of California campuses. He spoke to agricultural commissioners. He said their eyes just glazed over. They didn't pay attention. He left. I talked to another former Monsanto employee. He said that they had found some animal feeding trials with rats or mice that had gone bad. They had some clear evidence of problems, so they were trying to rewrite the study so that the problems would disappear. And he said 3 of his colleagues who were doing safety studies on bovine growth hormone stopped drinking milk unless it was organic. I talked to one guy in St. Louis. I write about this in Seeds of Deception. I happened to have lunch with him and didn't know who he was, and he mentioned he was a safety researcher for food at Monsanto. And so I asked him, well, what about, you're messing up certain sequences when you insert the genes. What if you mess up a sequence that's important? He said, well, we're learning more about what's important all the time. I'm thinking, great, it's about time. But then I said,
we're eating it.
Yeah, exactly. And I said, what about the fact that the whole sequence may be important? What if there's quantum mechanical and field effects that we don't even understand yet regarding DNA, and you don't even know how to evaluate the destruction that you may be causing in the DNA and those that eat it? He had absolutely nothing to say. He just looked at his food and then started eating again. And then after a couple of minutes, he looked up and said, but we need genetic engineering. And he started giving me the feed the world thing. And I explained to him, no, organic and sustainable agriculture can do it better. He had no idea. It turns out it's clearly true that organic and sustainable agriculture is much better than genetic engineering because, GMOs, the average crop produces yield, whereas organic and sustainable can increase outputs by 73%, 79%, 100%, 300%, depending on which study you look at. And productivity alone is not going to feed the world because it's not a productivity issue. Ultimately, it's a question of economics and distribution. So he was apparently convinced. And I talked to another safety guy that was doing safety studies as a contractor for Monsanto, and we went deep into the science, and there was no way I was letting him go. I was like, grabbing on and saying, but this, but this, but this. And it finally came down to, I said, but based on what you said, you have to admit that there is no way that you can guarantee that your GM crop is not going to cause an allergic reaction, at least some percentage of the population, which might end up killing them. And his response was, but we need genetic engineering. Because I've been to India and I've seen the productivity and we need it. In other words, it was the same final argument. He could not defend the health of his products, just like the same other guy, and came down to the last argument, feed the world. And it turns out they did put in GMOs in India, and 125,000 estimated farmers have committed suicide based on the lack of reliability of their cotton plants, and thousands of animals have died, and thousands of people are getting allergic reactions from touching the cotton, and people are eating the cottonseed oil, and animals are eating the cottonseed in the plants, and it's a complete disaster. And they've proven that they can get farmers in developing countries to buy this product even if it's bad for their bottom line because of the disinformation.
Did I hear you earlier in your speech today say that now what has happened in India after the last few episodes with the deaths of the animals, the deaths of the farmers, the itching and the rashes, that they're not going to allow it anymore?
No, what happened in India is this. There were 2 or 3 things happening in parallel. One is a movie came out on February 4th called Poison on the Platter by Mahesh Bhatt, based on my book, largely genetically led, and they would do showings in different cities, launches in different cities, so all the big media from each of the cities would come and report on it. So without even putting it on TV, it became the most talked about film in India. It's a brilliant strategy, incredibly brilliant. It still hasn't been on TV, and there's tens of thousands of copies circulating around the country, and it's been shown to all these reporters, and it's been shown to Supreme Court members and whatnot. It has made a huge impact. It has changed the opinion of people about GMOs. It's raised the issue about health for the first time among many people. And it has created a situation where, according to the director, it would be an uprising if they tried to introduce a new GM crop, especially because the 2 spiritual leaders in there with 300 million followers came out strongly against GMOs. So that's one piece. And that happened in 9 weeks. From the time it was launched, 9 weeks later, I got the email saying it would be virtually impossible. So the tipping point in a high-profile way can be very rapid. There was also a Supreme Court challenge, which resulted in the Supreme Court assigning a top scientist to the approval committee who evaluated and found it to be a complete fraud, complete facade, completely inappropriate methods of looking at GMOs, saying essentially the entire health and environment of India is at risk, and called for a moratorium. The Supreme Court has asked the government to respond to the allegations, so it's in process now, but that's an issue. Also, India's changed its leaders and the new environment ministers against GM food crops, and the Planning Commission has come out against GM food crops. I had spoken to several members in a presentation, so I think I had something to do with that. Anyway, there's a change going on in India where there was this huge, swift motion that was, the trajectory was to introduce genetically modified eggplant by now. But fortunately, there was also groups that approached the health minister. He came out against GMOs. He sent some of his people to the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee, supported this top biologist, and at least they stopped the approval that was going to be like a rubber stamp that the eggplant would have been on the market. And so they put that into committee to study. They were looking at some of the international scientists that had come out with comments that had submitted to the Supreme Court and to the GEAC, which showed that the eggplant had horrendous possibilities for the health. And so now it looks like the eggplant is thoroughly delayed. I can't say it's going to be taken off the market completely, but it's thoroughly delayed.
What about China and Mexico?
Mexico just passed a law allowing for GM corn field trials in the north part of Mexico, which is a very great shame. They are the home.
They are the home of corn,
right?
And there was conversation that they would hold it sacred and not allow the GMOs in there.
Right. So they're allowing planting in a supposedly faraway place, but as we know from several studies, they've already contaminated the indigenous corn supply. You see, NAFTA has allowed corn to be introduced into Mexico, where it's cheaper for Mexicans to import U.S. corn that's subsidized than it is for them to grow it themselves. So the corn supply went from about 2 million metric tons to over 6 million metric tons. I've heard, if I remember correctly, over 2 million farmers have been driven from their land and lost their farms. And when people take the corn, which is not allowed up until this, hasn't been allowed to grow the genetically modified corn seeds, but people buy it and they plant it, and then it blows on the wind and it cross-contaminates. So some of the top people in the Mexican government are very pro-GM. One guy actually allegedly threatened a UC Berkeley professor, implying we know where your children go to school, trying to get him not to publish the initial evidence of the contamination, because there was a lot of money to be made. I don't know if it was individual for them, but certainly with Mexico, the perception was that they were going to make a lot of money by allowing GMOs to be planted. And the knowledge of the fact that it had been contaminating indigenous corn supply was, they were scared it would delay the introduction of biotechnology in the country. So Mexico has been sort of co-opted by the biotech industry. They passed the laws. In China has the opinion, it's kind of, they're aware that there's not universal acceptance of GMOs, so certain regions don't grow GMOs, but the government came out with a statement saying that it's important to fast-track GMOs. They believe that it will be successful. They've had problems when they introduced cotton. Initially, the BT cotton growers had less use of pesticides, higher yields and higher income, but 7 years later, their BT cotton was overrun with other pests. They were spraying 15 to 20 times more and making less money per acre. And there was a guy that his team developed BT, or genetically modified rice. I think it was BT rice. And evidently, someone tried to push it on the market, and it was found in rice products in Europe and in Hong Kong. And it was apparently, allegedly, purposely pushed into the market, even though it was illegal. So I think that there's also been disinformation around China. I would love to get my materials translated into Chinese and somehow brought to the top people in the government so that they can see the folly. I think when I speak to certain leaders, and this happened very early, I was in my second week of touring with Seeds of Deception, and I was in Cancun at the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference. And I was meeting with lots of ministers of trade. And I met with several of them from Africa. And I handed them my book and said, this book shows that genetically modified foods, turns out, are actually unsafe, and that it was industry manipulation and political collusion, not sound science, that allowed them into our diet. And the response uniformly among every African minister I told that to was, yeah, it makes sense. They just accepted it. They just knew. There was no resistance. They go, yeah, it makes sense. They'd seen the corruption of science, the corruption of politics, the corruption of their ideals and their culture for so many years, and so they were completely willing to accept it. I don't know if the Chinese government has any idea the level of political manipulation of the science and of the economic figures, and I think if they did, they would probably come around and kick GMOs out.
What about Africa?
Africa has had a lot of skepticism towards GMOs. South Africa is the only country that's been growing in a big time commercializing way. There is a West African country, I forget which, that does the BT cotton, and Kenya is opening up right now to GMOs. But there is an African model law which is strict and protective of the African environment, and there's a lot of countries that are very skeptical and concerned about GMOs. There were 5 countries that were in a famine a few years ago and were receiving food aid from the United States and found out that the aid was genetically modified corn. And so they all asked for non-GM corn, and the U.S. said, tough, eat it or starve. So a couple of them said, can you mill it so our farmers won't grow it? And the U.S. declined, because evidently it's a planned way of contamination. In fact, a friend of mine was debating someone from USAID about GMOs in South Africa when the cameras went out. They continued to debate. At one point she said in anger, you just wait, there'll be so much GM corn planted in South Africa, no one in Africa could plant non-GM corn. So she was admitting in her rage that their plan was to contaminate, and this was an example. So South Africa intervened in terms of the food aid and ground up the corn to give to these 2 countries, but Zambia refused. They had deployed a team of, I think it was Western trained scientists, to go to Europe and the United States and evaluate it, and they came back and said, don't you dare feed this to our people for health, environment, and economic reasons. And so this freaked out the U.S., and they did a full court press on Zambia to try and get them to accept it, because the whole myth was that GMOs were going to help feed the developing world, and here was a country that was starving that was turning them down, so it was a real myth buster. Yeah. So they decided to I talked to one minister who was in a meeting with Ann Veneman and then heard that he was from Zambia and just didn't shake his hand and just went backward country and walked away. Really sharp, horrible denunciation of an entire country. They sent several senators, congressmen, professors. Colin Powell tried to convince the Vatican to stop certain Jesuit priests that I'd interviewed from speaking about GMOs. They lied to the Jesuit order head in the U.S., saying that they were, about what the Jesuit priests were saying in Zambia. So there was a huge disinformation campaign, and it came under huge pressure. So when I had done a big interview in an investigative magazine in South Africa called Noseway, great name, and offered it to the government's paper in Zambia. They put it in a 2 full-page spread, in which someone who's been living there for 30 years said he's never seen an article so big. And they put the president's picture in the middle of my article, because the president was the one that had been vilified by the U.S. And here's an American saying that good on you, Zambia, for doing this. I spoke to the House of Chiefs, which is the 23 chiefs that, the third house of the legislature. There's the Senate and the Congress and the chiefs. And I apologized on behalf of the United States and said, this is evidence to show that you did the right thing. And so there are certain countries like Zambia, Angola, and others that are strongly against GMOs in Africa and have done a good job at standing up to the bullying.
So how do we, in effect, take that campaign to the people? Is that what you're saying? How do you do that?
Well, I demonstrate every time I speak that a room full of people are willing to change their lifelong eating habits just by knowing the truth about how dangerous GMOs are. And it can be done in the form of a live lecture, a videotape lecture, a brochure, a book, a film, a website, YouTube clips. It is so easy to convince someone that eating genetically engineered foods is dangerous to health. There's always 2 things that have to be presented. One is how it was approved. How was Michael Taylor over, the FDA documents made public from a lawsuit showed that the FDA scientists were actually very concerned about GMOs and predicted possible allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, but were ignored. That immediately changes the whole discussion into a different category. Instead of, GMOs will feed the world, it becomes, so it was corporate manipulation, so what's the real story? All of a sudden the receptor cells open. In fact, I always talk about the FDA thing, no matter where I speak, because that explains why those that are saying that it's safe have no credibility. Then you just have to describe either the actual findings with animal feeding studies or the theoretical risks. And now with the American Academy of Environmental Medicine saying that the link between GMOs and disease is a causal relationship based on recognized scientific criteria, and they list accelerated aging and immune system problems and asthma and allergies and cytokines and gastrointestinal disorders and problems with major organs. They have a long list of these, and it's part of their policy, and it's a brilliantly written document, and they ask doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets. They call for a moratorium. They call for independent long-term safety testing. They call for labeling. They're asking their own physicians to do evaluations clinically to report about possible problems from GMOs. So it is a precedent. And this makes it much easier for me to say, there's an entire medical organization that's evaluated it, and they're saying what we're saying.
Let me take the devil's advocate on that for a moment, because the doctors who are trained in environmental medicine are something of a rare bird. The average medical student gets 6 hours on nutrition. They get very little on chemical toxicity. The med school definition of detox is about drugs and alcohol. It's not about what you've seen with the chemical body burden that EWG's revealed. So how does that flush out?
All right, there's 3.
How do you get it into the mainstream medical community?
All right, first of all, the fact that an American medical organization has come out with that position is news for consumers everywhere in the world. So So whether or not we're convincing the average AMA physician or not, the fact that an American medical organization has come up with that is a big deal. Second, other organizations are expected to do the same. They're going to come out with also supportive documentation saying doctors believe that GMOs are unsafe. Three, wherever I speak, and it's granted, it's more of the progressive, A4M, Pan-American Allergy Association, even at the American Public Health Association, the particular group of people that I spoke with, are receptive. As soon as they hear the information, they go, oh, wow, I had no idea. The problem is just like they don't know much about nutrition, they don't know much about the GMO problems. And when they see the lecture and hear the information, they're on board. Unless they're like dyed-in-the-wool pro-GM, and they think that anyone who's speaking against GM is a Luddite and must be lying, and there's going to be them no matter what. So I've spoken at medical. The Sao Paulo Medical Society brought me into Brazil last year. I spoke at the Indian Medical Society's chapter a few months ago in one city. I've spoken at 12 accredited colleges, 12 accredited conferences in the United States. I was a keynote at the Naturopathic Conference. So where I speak to the doctors using medical terms, they're open. My guess is if a doctor doesn't really know much about GMOs and hears that the American Academy of Environmental Medicine says that animal feeding studies have linked it in a causal relationship with the following items, then it'll create the receptivity that maybe they don't know much about GMOs and they need to find out about it. So I think that I'm not skeptical. I'm not pessimistic about average doctors. But I think that as we know from the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, they're an organization of firsts. They're the first ones to talk about chemical sensitivity, the first ones to do a whole slew of defining and treating in certain ways that have become mainstream. So you have to start somewhere, and they're a good place to start.
Okay.
What we're interested in, I think, is the large area of everyone wants to know what is their ideal diet.
Okay.
And now that you've rattled off the foods in this country from soy to corn, the long list of foods that are already genetically modified. Mm-hmm. And it makes you, I believe, suspect that the chance of getting non-GMO corn or non-GMO soy raised in the U.S. today would be very small. Would that be?
Well, 91 or 92% of the soy acreage in the United States is non-GMO. When you talk to farmers and they say food-grade soy, they're talking about non-GMO. That often is sent to the Orient. A lot of the Japanese buy food-grade soy, which is non-GMO. If you look at the soy products in the stores, in the natural food stores, most of the soy products that have large percentage of soy, that advertise soy as the main ingredient, are organic or non-GM soy. And that's the case for a lot of the soy milk. I just was at a health conference 3 weeks ago, and they were giving away samples of a soy candy bar that didn't say it was non-GMO, which was very concerning to me. So yes, you can get non-GMO soy. Most of the soy in the United States that's grown is fed to animals. Okay? If you get soy protein isolate or soy lecithin or soy oil and it doesn't say it's non-GMO, you have to assume that it's GM because most of the soy is GM and they just combine soy from different farms into these crushing and processing plants and it'll be GM. So it's not impossible to get it. You just have to know what to look for. Is the soy 100% guaranteed to be non-GMO if it says so? Of course not, because we're dealing with nature. And nature does not have a way to put up a wall to inform all the GM soy, don't cross with the non-GM soy. In fact, one of the big problems with soy, since it doesn't cross-pollinate at a distance, is just human error, where there's mixing accidentally during harvest or transport or storage. And so you're going to get some genetically engineered soy in small quantities, even in the organic varieties. More so with corn and canola because it cross-pollinates. Now we have sugar beets, which can cross-pollinate at the seed level with the seeds being used for Swiss chard. So it's a big problem, and there's a lawsuit about that, and hopefully we'll be able to stop that from a legal perspective. So I live my life as an example of what I walk my talk. Okay, I ask people to avoid genetically engineered crop derivatives, and so I read labels, and if it has a at-risk ingredient, I don't use it. So what it means is, I would guess 90% of processed foods in the United States have GM ingredients. High fructose corn syrup, soy lecithin, corn oil, soy oil, cottonseed oil, canola oil. And so if I'm going to buy a processed food, then I'm much more likely to find something if I'm buying from a natural food store. But even then, I have to find out, because you can't just walk into a natural food store and assume everything on the shelf is non-GMO. You really have to do your homework. Then buying organic whenever I can. Then you get the extra benefit of organic, which is the reduction of the agricultural chemical burden in the system, and you're supporting a holistic, healthy system of agriculture, and there's an average of 25% more nutrients in the organic foods, and so you end up with healthier food supply by buying organic and avoiding GMOs at the same time.
If I lived in Japan, what percentage of the food consumed in Japan, since you just mentioned if you're eating processed food in U.S., that we have to assume that 90% of those eating processed food are getting some GMO food. Is the number substantially less than that?
Yeah, Japan will have much less. They have a labeling law which is very poor. They allow up to 5% contamination before requiring labeling of GMO. So you can actually buy soybeans that are 95% non-GMO and 5% GMO and still not have to label it as such. They also have no requirements for labeling canola oil as genetically engineered, because once something is turned into an oil, then it doesn't require labeling. So you'd have to know to avoid the soybean oil and the canola oil in Japan. But certainly the percentage is quite a bit different. I don't know what it is. I've only been to Japan speaking once, and I didn't get that information from them. But there's some major organizations in Japan that represent consumers, the Japanese Consumer Union and some of these major co-ops that have taken strong positions against GMOs. And recently, when states in Australia have agreed to finally allow genetically modified canola to grow, some of the Japanese buyers said they're going to look elsewhere for their canola sources, because even though it's not required to be labeled, there's a lot of marketing organizations that have committed to consumers not to use the GM canola.
So if we look at pet
foods have a lot of GMOs in them. In fact, horse diets have, in addition to the soy and corn, they have sugar beet pulp. And sugar beets became genetically engineered, harvested in the fall of 2008. Now I'm told that starting in around December of 2008 and continuing into 2009, there's been a lot of horse catastrophes in stables all over the United States, where broken legs and things like that. And one person out of nowhere says she thinks it's the gut bacteria related to GMOs, and that's so possible based on what I talk about. We can talk about that. So I'm very concerned about the horse population and the sugar beets pulp, because it's Roundup Ready sugar beets, and they've never been tested properly, and it could easily be causing massive damage to these animals. But pet foods, you look at the pet food, and unless it's organic or natural, it probably contains soy or corn derivatives. And I've talked to some veterinarians, and they've been very alarmed at the increase of certain health problems in dogs, for example, in the last decade. They talk about cancers and gastrointestinal problems and certain tumors, and they don't know what it's from. So when they come up to me after my talks and say, we've seen a lot of these problems in pets, And I'm like, I'd love to be able to say, here's $1 million to do some research, but there's no $1 million anywhere to do research. We just have to, at this point, know that there's huge danger associated with feeding animals or humans genetically engineered foods, and it's better to opt out and just say no in the meantime, even if we haven't done the full research to say what the mechanism is for why these things are dangerous.
This genetically modified food was not present in our diet in 1995. When did we introduce this?
Well, in 1994, they approved genetically modified bovine growth hormone, which is a drug that's injected into cows to increase milk supply. And they take E. coli bacteria and turn it into a factory by putting a cow gene in there, and then it produces the hormone, and then they concentrate the hormone and inject it into cows, and the milk has more pus, more bovine growth hormone, more antibiotics, and more IGF-1. It's very dangerous in my opinion, and we're educating people about that. So that's the first food related to GMOs in terms of dairy. There was a food supplement called L-tryptophan produced by a company called Showa in Japan, which starting in 1984 was genetically engineering bacteria to produce the tryptophan more economically, and that almost certainly was the cause of these contaminants that accumulated in that brand. And for the next 4 years it was killing Americans and causing paralysis and lifelong paralysis, and ultimately it killed about 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick or become disabled. And that was taken off the market because a series of coincidences made people realize, certain doctors realize, oh, there's an epidemic going on. It's been going on for 4 years. In 1994, they approved genetically modified tomatoes called the Flavor Saver tomato, but that was taken off the market a few years later. It was a marketing disaster. It didn't taste good. It didn't look good. It didn't hold up. And if you read the documents made public from a lawsuit, when they fed a version of that tomato to rats, 7 of 20 developed stomach lesions and 7 of 40 died within 2 weeks. But the main introduction of GM crops was in 1996 with soy, corn, cotton, and canola, all used for vegetable oil. And that came out, it expanded greatly over the next 5 years. And now it's about 92% of the soy, similar to the cotton, about 80% of the corn and canola. So it's huge numbers.
If we look at the largest source of genetically modified food in the average American consumer today, would it be high fructose corn syrup?
It's a good question. I would guess that if we say corn, yes.
Okay.
Corn, if you've read Michael Pollan's work, Omnivore's Dilemma, or Seafooding, which I'm about to see, but I've gotten some reports about it, it's clearly, and in the movie Corn is in so many things, in certain varieties, certain ways. And in fact, the inside cover of our non-GMO shopping guide, there's about 75 different derivatives, mostly from corn, but also from soy and some others that are genetically engineered. So I would say corn is number one and soy is two. Soy is also in a heck of a lot of things. Now, in the U.S., most of the genetically modified crops are given to animals for animal feed. And so the Center for Veterinary Medicine in the Food and Drug Administration wrote an opinion, the director wrote an opinion that genetically engineered foods might bioaccumulate toxins in the milk and meat of animals and could be very dangerous for health, and they were completely ignored. So people ask me, well, if I eat a hamburger from a cow that's eating GMOs, is it safe? I could say, well, is it safe to eat the meat from sick animals? We know that animals that have eaten genetically engineered crops have had potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system, larger intestines, smaller livers, larger livers. They've had, it goes on, changes in the cell structure of their livers, pancreas, and testicles, changes in the young sperm cells, higher deaths among their offspring, changes in the enzyme levels of the major organs, unexplained deaths, huge number of variables. So if you figure that these animals are getting huge amounts of soy and corn, it may be changing their physiology in some way that by eating these animals, a huge number of things could be happening. We don't know. I don't think that it's possible that the gene might transfer into the meat, and then we'll eat the meat, and that same gene will transfer into us. I think that gene transfer can happen certainly by eating the crops directly, but probably not by the milk, by the meat. In the milk, there is DNA from the feed, according to one study, so it is theoretically possible to get gene transfer from the milk. So we get the bulk of our GM sources from the animal feed, and a lot of it, which comes direct, like high fructose corn syrup, is very processed. The more processed something is, the lower the risk there is usually. So eating high fructose corn syrup does not eliminate, and when I talk about the less risk, I'm talking about the less risk from genetic engineering. I'm not talking about less risk from that. I mean, high fructose corn syrup may be very dangerous, whether it's genetically engineered or not. But if you look at high fructose corn syrup, people will say, well, there's no DNA in there after 3 days through these massive wet mills. There's no proteins in there. How could it be bad if all you do with a genetic engineering crop is put a gene in that creates a protein? If you don't have the gene there, you don't have the protein in there, it must be the same. But that's wrong thinking. The process of inserting a gene and growing the crop through cloning into a GM plant causes massive collateral damage in the DNA of the plant and can cause all sorts of compositional changes which might result in some higher levels of toxins or allergens which have been found in studies, and so that might survive the processing so that the high fructose corn syrup from genetically engineered corn might be more dangerous than the non-GM corn. So, but if you eat the corn on the cob that's genetically engineered, that'll be more dangerous. If you eat the corn chips, that will also be more dangerous than the high fructose corn syrup, but maybe not as dangerous as the corn on the cob.
If we look at the average consumer in America today, they are becoming alarmed about reactions they get when they eat food, and many of them have become aware of a newly evolving epidemic of gluten sensitivity. So I'm trying to look at alerting the consumer to the leaky bowel that we all talk about. We talk about leaky gut all the time today. And we have more and more people willing to buy things like a probiotic and even prebiotic and try to maintain some kind of gut health. And if we look at a health food store, they'll tell you that the huge volume of new business is people looking for gluten-free foods. So across this board, as we start to look at things that are increasing in the 10 plus years that we've had this exposure, there certainly seems to be increasing reactions to the food we eat.
I want to talk about this. This is a very important issue. There are many ways that eating genetically engineered foods may be responsible for an increase in allergic reactions, in multiple chemical sensitivity, in leaky gut, and in a whole host of immune system responses. What I do is I collect all the information about the health risks in the world that I can, interview the scientists in depth so I can convey what they come up with to the average person. And so I have strands of information, many of which will relate to each other, but let me try and parse it and explain. Eating, and so it'll be a combination of allergies, leaky gut, autoimmune, and all that, so we'll just take a look at it that way. Let's talk about increasing allergic reactions to, or sensitivities to, foods other than the GM crops by eating GM crops. When mice were fed genetically modified soy, the pancreatic enzymes reduced by as much as 77%. Now that was in the starch-eating enzymes, but there was also changes in the cells that suggest that the protein-eating enzymes also were suppressed. Now, one of the characteristics of an allergen is that it is resistant to digestion. So the protein lasts longer in the digestive tract. if you have a system where you are deficient in protein digesting enzymes, meaning that any standard protein that you bring in is going to last longer, and that means that you have the capacity to have an allergic reaction for those proteins. So you can all of a sudden, just by eating genetically modified soy, end up to be allergic to a wide variety of food proteins. It is interesting that peanut allergies doubled in the 5 years after GM soy was introduced. This suppressed digestive enzyme may be an issue. But there's another issue with soy. Soy is cross-reactive with peanuts. Whether you're GM or not, a certain percentage of people that are allergic to peanuts get triggered by soy. Because of all the changes that occur in the DNA and in the plants as a result of the insertion process, it is possible that the genetic engineering of the soy has increased the cross-reactivity to peanuts. Right? There's a study with BT, which is the pesticide produced by corn and cotton and the BT genetically modified crops. They fed BT to mice, and the mice developed sensitivities, immune reactions, not just to the BT, but also to other compounds that were formerly harmless, showing an increase in chemical sensitivity. Now, there's many reasons why BT may be responsible for this, and we'll get back to it. And they did another study in Australia with peas, and they found that when they fed genetically modified peas to mice, the mice also developed multiple chemical sensitivity in that they were reactive to other formerly harmless compounds. Now, one way that we can become overreactive is if we just simply start having allergic reactions to one thing. I'm told by allergists that increased immune response and sensitivity can then spread to others, simply because we have the burden of the immune reaction. So, simply by producing an allergen, we can end up being sensitive to a wide variety of things. Genetically modified soy has a known allergen, trypsin inhibitor, which is as much as 7 times higher in it compared to non-GM soy when they're cooked. The evidence suggests that when it's normally broken down in the cooking process, doesn't break down so easily in the genetically modified soy, so we could be creating huge amounts of allergic reactions by the genetic engineering process. Another group did a skin prick test and found that 1 person out of 8, all 8 people were reactive to GM soy, but 1 person was not reactive to natural soy. So if a certain percentage of the population is reactive only to GM soy and not to non-GM soy, it says something is different about the GM soy. So they looked into the proteins and they said, oh, what's this new protein? It's in the GM soy but not in the non-GM soy. And they find that it was able to bind with IgE antibodies, so it is an allergen or a potential allergen that could cause theoretically anaphylactic shock, and it was in the GM soy and not the non-GM soy. Even the genetically engineered soy is engineered to produce soybeans that are not killed by Roundup herbicide. So the protein that's produced is the Roundup-ready protein. That protein has properties of a known allergen, and that might cause this allergic response. In fact, the gene from the soy gets transferred into the gut bacteria and continues to produce this protein inside of our gut long after we stop eating GM soy, so we may be continuously triggering an allergic and immune system reaction which could essentially increase our sensitivity to a wide range of allergens. And it's not just allergic responses we're seeing. With the peas, we saw inflammatory responses, which doctors tell me is more critical than just simply an immune system reaction. All right. Having said that, just to finish up, BT is a pure allergen. People got sprayed with natural BT, which is used as an insecticide by forestry. They got an allergic reaction, rashes all over their body, etc. Now people who are picking the cotton that produces the BT from within the cells are getting the same allergic reactions. So there's evidence that the BT is an allergen by itself. There's evidence that the soy is an allergen by itself, and that there's changes that occur within the plants that also increase other allergens. Now let's talk about the gut. I know this is where you're going. BT is designed to split open the stomach of insects and kill them. What happens is the natural bacteria produces the protoxin, which is not yet toxic. There's a safety catch on there. When it goes into the alkaline stomach of the insect, the safety catch is cleaved, the thing becomes a toxin, becomes activated, and kills the insect. They're not exactly sure of the mechanics of it, but I understand that if you eliminate all of the gut bacteria in the insect and then put the BT in it, it doesn't work. So somehow there's an interaction between the bacteria in the gut and the BT that makes it a successful killer. They had claimed that BT toxin does not interact with mammals because supposedly we have no receptor cells, so it doesn't hook up. But they're ignoring the evidence. It certainly does. It's been able to bind with proteins in the gut of the rhesus monkey, and it binds in areas that are the same areas where it binds with insects that kill the insect. Now, if we expect that BT toxin causes a disruption of the walls of our intestines, we are basically creating leaky gut. And, I mean, it's such an obvious connection. It's designed to split open certain types of cells in insects, and it's shown that when you feed it BT toxin to mice, it damages their small intestines. I've seen the microscopic slides. They're just totally damaged. There's pieces all over there. If it's breaking apart the integrity of our gut, then we are creating a catastrophe. Because as you know better than I, when you have leaky gut, you allow toxicity to enter into the bloodstream, which can theoretically, especially in babies who don't have a developed blood-brain barrier, can end up toxifying their brain, and that is what some people believe is linked to autism and all these other behavioral and other problems. Now, it gets worse, unfortunately, the whole gut bacteria concept. The only human feeding study ever conducted showed that genes from soy transferred to the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines, our intestinal flora, and continued to function. This was the pro-GM government that funded the study. As soon as they found out the answer, no more study. They stopped it. They never tested to see if BT genes transferred. What if the BT gene transfers? It might turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories, possibly for the rest of our lives. If that happens, it means we are producing toxins inside of us that might break open the walls of our intestines and other parts of our digestive tract. In addition, even if it doesn't break the walls, it could possibly damage the gut bacteria balance. And if that happens, a whole series of digestive disorders can ensue, and I'll let you talk about that because you're the expert at that. I'll just say, if you mess up the gut bacteria, you are like messing up a major organ. There's 10 times as many cells in the gut bacteria than there are in the entire body. It's part of our digestive system, immune system. It produces vitamins. It is part of the barrier that protects against entrance into the bloodstream, and you don't want to mess with that. And a lot of the kids that have autism and problems, they have tremendous problems in their gut bacteria. We don't know if it's a cause or an effect. Maybe you do. I have suspicions, but
we believe.
All right. So, if you end up populating your gut bacteria with genes from genetically modified crops, and they are optimized to transfer into bacteria inside our intestines as opposed to plant genes, and they're optimized to function in bacteria as opposed to plant genes, then we can be shifting this really important organ, our gut bacteria. Now, the promoter, when the genes are inserted into crops, they have an on switch called a promoter. And the theory was it would only turn on the attached gene, but it could also turn on genes downstream. So if the promoter transfers to our gut bacteria, and it does according to this study, it might turn on other genes inside the bacteria. The genes might also transfer to our own cells inside our digestive tract and might turn on things at random. The promoter also has what's called a recombinant hotspot, which means it may be unstable and cause spontaneous rearrangements. It might even wake up dormant viruses which have been deposited into our DNA from previous species. So it's really a genetic roulette. It's throwing a dart into maybe our own DNA, saying, turn on anything at random, cause random mutations, and if it happens to sit next to an ancient virus, turn it on and reintroduce it after a million years. So you have that wild card. You have the antibiotic-resistant marker genes, which are in most foods. If they transfer, they can create super diseases, which are unkillable with antibiotics. You have the Liberty-linked gene. This is interesting. Liberty, just like Roundup Ready protects plants from being sprayed by Roundup, Liberty-Link allows Liberty herbicide, glufosinate ammonium, to be sprayed on plants. Now, glufosinate ammonium has been shown to cause brain damage. Glufosinate ammonium has been shown to create brain damage when fed to pregnant rodents during certain times when the fetus is developing. So brain damage in the fetus. When you use Liberty Link corn and you spray with glufosinate ammonium, it supposedly detoxifies the glufosinate into something called NAG, N-acetylglufosinate, and that gets accumulated in the plant. NAG is not part of our diet. When they take NAG and they feed it to goats or mice, they look in the feces and they find, some of the NAG has been retoxified back into glufosinate. In fact, they found in the goat kidneys and livers glufosinate, the toxic herbicide, which had come into the body as NAG, and somehow, probably because of the gut bacteria, converted it into herbicide. So eating a genetically modified Liberty Link corn might produce herbicides inside us. Now, the biotech industry proponent that challenged me when I wrote about this admitted that it was true, and his only defense was, well, it's in such small quantities, I'm sure it's not a problem. But as I pointed out in my article, which he failed to address, that certain of these pesticides in small quantities are endocrine disruptors. Glufosinate has never been evaluated as an endocrine disruptor, and so it might cause endocrine disruption in the person who's eating it and in the fetal development, etc. So that's another aspect of gut bacteria. Now, if the Liberty Link gene transfers into our gut bacteria, it might actually facilitate the retoxification of Liberty Link and cause, when you eat the Liberty Link, you'll be eating the Liberty Link corn, which is saturated with the Liberty herbicide. The Liberty Link corn, the same enzyme which causes it to detoxify might cause it to retoxify. If it ends up in there, then you end up with a cycle because it will also survive in the presence of glufosinate ammonium. And so it has a selective advantage and can live long and prosper. And if you continue to eat Liberty Link corn, you may continue to populate more and more herbicide will be produced inside of you. It's a horrible thing. Only a few of us have ever thought of that. And we're alarmed because it's scientifically defensible and it's never been tested. In addition, the herbicide-tolerant crops. You see, if a gene transfers to your gut bacteria, the big question is it going to offer a selective survival advantage? If it offers a survival advantage, it can live long and multiply. Okay? If it doesn't offer a survival advantage, it just may disappear. It may just transfer in a small way and then disappear. But if it can cause that strain of bacteria to outlive neighboring bacteria, then that particular characteristic will be shared and you'll end up big colonization. Now, consider this. The herbicide-tolerant Roundup Ready soy has a lot of Roundup on it, huge amounts of residue because it's sprayed like crazy even after the seeds are produced, and so you end up soaking these crops with Roundup herbicide. Roundup herbicide is an antibacterial. It kills bacteria. It's an antibiotic. So we're talking about how genetically engineered crops can change the balance of gut bacteria. One aspect of the crops is that you spray more herbicide on herbicide-tolerant crops, huge numbers amount, huge amount. And the herbicide the residues can be there 10, 20, 50 times more. You eat those herbicides as part of the crops, and they can kill gut bacteria because they're antibiotic properties. That's both glyphosate, which is Roundup, and glufosinate ammonium, which is Liberty. Now imagine that the gene that allows these crops to survive Roundup or Liberty transfers to your gut bacteria. That means that particular gut bacteria survives when you've just also eaten the herbicide. So that means there is a competitive survival advantage for the bacteria that have the herbicide-tolerant crop genes in them. So they can live long and multiply, because now you're eating lots of soy or corn or whatever, and you're pouring in the herbicides, and what is surviving but the Roundup-ready gut bacteria, or the Liberty-linked gut bacteria. And so it's producing Roundup-ready proteins, which have properties of a known allergen, a dust mite allergen. So you might be triggering that. Now, on top of that, so the gene that's inserted into the soy is transferred into the gut bacteria. Some scientists decided to look at the RNA. Some scientists decided to look at the RNA that was being produced from this inserted Roundup-ready gene. And normally, there's a promoter at one side and a terminator switch at the other that says, stop reading here is the end of the gene. The terminator wasn't working. And the RNA that was being produced was not only the RNA from the inserted gene, but it was like way beyond it. It was a whole extra gene fragment that had been inserted, plus a scrambled section of mutated genes that had occurred as a result of the process of insertion. So you have this really long RNA, which in turn got reassembled into 4 different variations. Alternate splicing for those that know it. So now you have 4 different types of RNA being produced from this one inserted gene, none of which was intended. So it can produce 4 different proteins. We don't know if they're allergens. We don't know anything about it. Okay? So now this means inside of us, we have the potential to be producing all these different proteins in our gut bacteria, which is growing over time because it offers a survival advantage because it doesn't die when we eat the herbicide-laden products. Right?
Yes.
So now, if you screw up the gut bacteria, you've got digestion on the ropes, you've got immune system on the ropes, you've got production of certain vitamins on the ropes, you've got the gut-blood barrier compromised, and then you end up with all sorts of issues. And I've seen experts speak about this, but I'm not an expert. So I'm not going to venture into trying to tell you what the etiology of disease is when you've stripped out or changed the gut bacteria, but I've seen the diagrams, and it's not pretty.
And since we have a major epidemic in that same 10-year period, we know that people became increasingly sensitive to peanuts and more huge amount of people reacting to gluten. And then the epidemic of something that's called learning disorders, whether you call it autism or Asperger or ADHD, learning disorders. And it would seem that the direction has been straight up over that same period of time.
By the way, Linda, that was the piece I wanted you to hear. If GMOs are causing problems, gut bacteria problems, for example, one thing that we do find in the literature is that those who have gut bacteria problems typically have multiple chronic illnesses. The incidence of multiple chronic illnesses in the United States, which is 3 or more according to this study, in 1996 was 7%. That's when GMOs were introduced. 9 years later, it was 13%, practically double. It makes complete sense to me that GMOs may be a major contributor to that. because those that are susceptible to the effects of GMOs might be susceptible in a way that's expressing multiple chronic illnesses, either from the gut bacteria or from who knows what. I mean, there's so many things that have shown to go wrong. So the sensitive population, or the population that eats large amounts of it, might be showing a lot of the different symptoms. Food-related illnesses in the United States doubled between 1994 and 2001, according to the Center for Disease Control, and that also may be GMO-related. Autism, allergies, obesity, diabetes, certain cancers have all been on the rise since GMOs have been introduced. Here's an interesting one. Low birth weight babies, infant mortality, and infertility, all on the rise in the United States. All three are showing up in the laboratory research on animals fed GMOs and the livestock of animals fed GMOs. You have the Russian rat study, which showed more than half of the offspring of mothers that were fed GM soy died within 3 weeks, and their size was much smaller, and the offspring from the GM-fed mothers were unable to reproduce. You have the mice that were fed GM soy showing changes in their sperm cells and changes in their embryo DNA expression. In an Austrian study, they fed corn that was both BT and Roundup ready, stacked genes to mice. The more corn that was fed to the mice, the less babies they had, the smaller the babies were. You have all sorts of infertility information coming in from livestock. You have 24 farmers in the U.S. saying certain varieties of BT corn cause their pigs or cows to become sterile. Some pigs had false pregnancies or gave birth to bags of water. You have buffalo in India who were eating genetically modified cottonseed cakes, and more than half of them had reproductive problems, common abortions, premature deliveries, infertility, prolapsed uteruses. So you have livestock experience, you have laboratory experience, and you have statistics in the United States as the bigger guinea pig group of those of us eating GMOs. And I'll give just an interesting story. When scientists discover adverse findings about GMOs, typically they're fired, stripped of responsibilities, forced out, threatened, vilified, attacked, lose funding. They go through the ropes. And this was the case of Dr. Irina Ermakova, senior researcher at the Russian National Academy of Sciences. She and I gave a talk at the European EU Parliament, and we sat together afterwards with a parliamentarian. She explained to us how her boss had been pressured by his boss, so she was told no more GMO research. And one of her colleagues actually tried to comfort her by saying, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. Now, she wasn't comforted. She was also attacked in the press, in journals, by the pro-biotech boys that I read about all the time with completely unscientific and inappropriate charges. One, however, was accurate in the sense she didn't do a biochemical analysis of the feed, so it's possible there was some toxin in the soy flour that was separate from the genetic engineering of the soy, just some random toxin that caused the astounding death rate, small size of the offspring, and infertility. Well, she had done her studies 3 times with similar results, and then the entire facility she was working at started feeding all of the rats genetically modified soy-based rat chow. And within 2 months, she asked her colleagues, what is your offspring mortality rate? And it skyrocketed to over 55%, suggesting it wasn't a particular toxin in her feed, but it was a generic aspect of soy, and in fact, it may have meant that GM soy is in fact solving the overpopulation problem. I mean, we have low birth weight babies spiked around the time GMOs were introduced. The infant mortality rate in the United States, we're the 48th country on earth. There's 47 countries that have less infant mortality. And infertility, of course, is very high, both for males and females, and also partial fertility. So I have to be clear. I can't say it's a smoking gun. I could say it's a very interesting correlational evidence. The lines of evidence converge to support this as as a possible cause. But I also want to say no one should have to wait until the studies are done in order to take action. And the action is demonstrated by the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, who in May 2009 said doctors should prescribe to patients to avoid GMOs. They shouldn't eat them. There's causal relationship between GMOs and reproductive problems and immune system problems and gastrointestinal disorders and problems in major organs and increased accelerating aging. They were very specific. And so I think we've got to take the doctor's advice here and avoid GMOs. They also suggested that patients receive information about the health risks, and we have that at our Institute for Responsible Technology at responsibletechnology.org. We have a brochure that doctors can hand out to patients. We have a non-GMO shopping guide that doctors can give to patients. We sell them just above our cost. And they're also free in many health food stores, so if you get a health food store near you to get it, you can just order it from the health food store in bundles of 50. And we also have thick texts and reports and PowerPoint presentations, plenty of ways that we've dealt with this massive evidence now, which is really overwhelming, irrefutable evidence of harm. When I speak to presidents and ministers and senators and regulatory agencies, I give them my book, Genetic Roulette. It's got 65 health risks. And they say, use the 65 health risks as a checklist, a biosafety checklist. Demand from the biotech industry that they give you independent, rigorous scientific data to counter each of the risks. If they can, I have no health argument. If they can't, there's no justification for keeping these foods on the market. And I said, I have been waiting since I published the book in April of 2007 for them to turn over the information. I have 65 pages on my website with summaries of each of the risks with a request saying, please submit challenges, responses, or updates. And I predicted in my book that I wouldn't receive any. And I haven't, because we know exactly the information that they have. The scientific research that they do is described by many world experts as meaningless, as total facade, and they don't have the data. In fact, many of their studies, which are meticulously designed to avoid finding problems, these guys have bad science down to a science, that even then they still end up with dead animals that they say, without justification, is not treatment related. They end up with statistically significant changes in organ size and other problems, which they write off as not biologically significant simply because they say so. And then they use unscientific comparisons where if it turns out it's statistically significant compared to the carefully controlled control group, they'll look at other studies that have been raising animals under completely different conditions and compare it to those. Or in some cases, bring in a control group that's rigged, in the case of some compositional analysis, that's designed to have some really weird results that make their results look okay. And I love this chapter in my book. I love being a detective to show how these guys are so blatant. I mean, here's one that everyone can relate to. The genetically engineered bovine growth hormone injected into cows to increase milk supply. Documents were stolen from the FDA and sent to Dr. Epstein, who evaluated and then published his findings. And he said that it turns out that they had a study designed to show that injections did not interfere with the fertility of cows, and that was their conclusion. But when you look at the information, it appears that they secretly added cows to the study. They were pregnant before they were ever injected. All right? When they looked at the milk, they said, 90% of the hormone is destroyed. The bovine growth hormone is destroyed in the milk because of pasteurization. And the FDA quoted that in their own article. Turns out they didn't feed the animal the normal bovine growth hormone that made it to the market. They used a different formulation. It was about 2.2% of the dosage. And they over-pasteurized the milk 120 times longer. They only destroyed 19%, so they added powdered hormone to the milk. 147 times the natural occurring level of hormone was added to the milk in powdered form. They heated it 120 times longer than normal, and then they destroyed 90% of it and say, aha, see, pasteurization destroys 90% of the hormone. And these are the people who are officially responsible for determining if our foods are safe. Monsanto is officially responsible for determining if their foods are safe. They told us PCBs, DDT, and Agent Orange was safe. They've even gotten convicted from lying about the safety of their foods and quietly poisoning people in the other factories. So we are in a very dangerous situation because never before in our lives or in the history of the human race have we deployed an infant technology where we're exposing the entire population. It also self-replicates in the environment and can outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste by a contaminated gene pool. So this technology has unprecedented risks. And the level of care that has been exerted, has been deployed in a sense on it is so weak, is so flimsy, is so horrific that we are gambling with the health of this and all future generations. And for why? Because certain companies want to make billions of dollars.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the...
Yes, it's very important. I can scare the heck out of people just by telling them the truth, but I hate to leave people in knots. I don't eat genetically engineered food crop derivatives. I know how to avoid it. I've helped create the non-GMO shopping guide, which has brand names. We produced it with another organization. 53% of Americans say they would avoid GMOs if labeled. 9 out of 10 Americans want GMOs labeled. GMOs can be eliminated from the food supply when even 5%, in my opinion, of consumers conscientiously avoid brands containing GM ingredients. Because it'll drop the market share of the big companies, it'll reduce their profit of the food companies. I'm not talking about the biotech companies. It'll show a trend, and these major companies have already removed GMOs from Europe and Japan. Let's say, oh, it's happening in the United States. Time to switch to the non-GM supply. They can simply tell the farmers, forward contract to non-GM for the next season, and it's done. So the tipping point happened in Europe, where within a single week, virtually every major food company committed to stop using GM ingredients. So in Europe, when the tipping point happened, virtually the entire food industry committed to stop using GMOs within a single week. And that happened in a 10-week period as a result of one single event that happened 10 weeks earlier that conveyed information about GMOs into a high-profile food safety scandal. So it can happen very quickly. We have a plan to end the genetic engineering of the food supply in North America by educating a significant percentage of consumers about the health dangers of GMOs. And this video is part of that. I encourage doctors to educate parents and prescribe non-GMO diets, and patients and support groups to spread the word about how dangerous this is. I am asking people to take responsibility. That's been the problem. People stopped taking responsibility for it from the beginning. The FDA abdicated and said, Monsanto can determine if the foods are safe. Other countries figured that the FDA has looked at it, so they don't have to look at it. Everyone's passing the buck. So I would say, no. It's got to stop. And it should stop with all of us. We should all say, we will end the genetic engineering of the food supply. I'm saying that. I want others to join me. And what does that mean? It means create a GM-free zone in our homes, in our bodies, and start educating others. So we have created the materials to make it easy. No one has to become a GMO food safety expert. We've done years of that. We can do it. We have our lectures on audios and videos and right brain material, left brain material, and visuals. We've got the materials. All we're asking for is distribute the information. And who wants to know which foods are non-GMO? 9 out of 10 Americans. So those listening to this may be considering themselves marginal in a lot of areas, but in this case we're mainstream. It may seem odd, but we are mainstream by being against GMOs. Most of Americans, according to New York Times and CBS polls, say they would avoid GMOs if they were labeled. So we're just giving people what they want, and we don't have to beg the government for labeling, although Obama promised he would do it and hasn't come through yet. We don't have to beg Obama. We don't have to beg the FDA. We can do it ourselves. We're at the top of the food chain. We control. We vote with our dollars, and in this case, we don't even have to do it for altruistic reasons. We don't have to do it to protect farmers or to protect the environment. We can do it simply because we don't want to turn our intestinal flora into living pesticide factories, or be infertile, or give birth to low birth weight babies, or have problems in future generations. We can do it simply because we know the truth. And so getting rid of GMOs is going to be easier than getting rid of all these other health and environmental problems. that do require legislation, that do require convincing the public, we can go to the health-conscious shoppers, to the progressive doctors, to the parents of young kids, to the religious organizations that believe GMO really means God move over. We have enough people who are wanting to hear this information. We have the information. We need to connect to them. So I encourage those who have this message to take the responsibility. Just grab our free stuff off of responsibletechnology.org and put it on your list and in your magazines and your friends' hands, and we'll do it together.
Jeffrey Smith, I thank you for your passion and for your enthusiasm and for your knowledge. It will happen because of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.